The day is June 3rd at midnight, 1864. Grant has already had the Army of the Potomac fight at Spotsylvania Courthouse and the Wilderness that sparked his overland campaign. Now he's fought at Hanover Station and moved south towards Richmond. But to get to Richmond, Lee has blocked every direct way to get there. But to keep his supply chain moving, Grant is moving east and south. That way he's able to maintain his logistics for supplies. And with him is the 89th New York. And on June 3rd at 4:30 a.m., Grant has set out and directed Meade to attack the Confederates at Cold Harbor, once again putting the Army of the Potomac on the same grounds they once fought 2 years prior during the Peninsula Campaign that McClellan once led, and where the Army of the Potomac suffered one of its first major losses. And that's where we are today, at Cold Harbor. Now, right now, I'm just beginning to follow in the 89th New York's footsteps. They are the last line of the frontal assault with the 27th Massachusetts, the 25th Massachusetts, and a couple other regiments in front of them. But they're the last ones to attack, or at least in the attacking line. And I am right now exactly walking their footpath on this trail with myself alone. Next to me, there's a creek, and they will work out on the other side another attacking Union line. But as I walk here, following in the footsteps, I get to be a part of that, in a sense. They are going to charge at 4:30 the Confederate earthworks with Stannard as their go-to guy to get them going. And they will assault at 4:30 and be the last one to assault the Confederate earthworks. Now, from what I've gathered, especially thanks to the folks at the Cold Harbor National Battlefield, Rangers, the 89th New York never submitted an after-action report or anything to help me. But I was given some useful information about a Massachusetts soldier who fought here, that they had information on about their attack. So when they attack, it said that the Massachusetts men were put in this meat grinder, and when they were put in this meat grinder, as a battlefield term, There was a really great amount of casualties, and the 89th New York were caught up by Standard, who grabbed the regimental flags and the regimental colors and came up to him and said, you know, will you guys not let to see your line fall? And the 89th New York took charge and stormed, or at least attacked, the Confederate earthworks here at Cold Harbor. Now, Stannard will get injured. I believe he'll be shot in the wrist and receive that wound. But the 89th New York will suffer some casualties. But for the most part, before the battle, the Massachusetts gentleman who wrote his own story, he said the 89th built their own trenches here, which the Union trenches that I see right now, he could have dug up and created before the assault. Because, you know, you need to have some kind of covering fire, because Cold Harbor here didn't have much of anything. These trees weren't here. It was all an open area. So the earthworks we see today were built by those such of like the 89th and led a charge up to it. So actually I have here the Battles of the Civil War, the Eastern Theater by the American Battlefield Trust. And as I look at it, I see Stannard's brigade, or Stannard's division. It is the 27th Massachusetts, the 25th Massachusetts, the 23rd Massachusetts, and the 55th Pennsylvania. But since the 89th New York didn't turn in an after action report, they were left out. But the 89th is right after that for the 55th Pennsylvania. So that solves my mystery with that. So yeah, I have it right there. And the gentleman at the Cold Harbor National Battlefield Visitor Center, he's the one who helped me find that one out. So yeah. So it says here, throughout the day on June 2nd, Lee took full advantage of the inactivity from the Federal troops. The Confederates shifted their lines as well, moving strength against strength, and with their enormous luxury of time, they constructed formidable defensive positions. The lessons of Fredericksburg had been learned by Lee's engineers, and the rebel soldiers dug a primary trench line deep enough for men to fire their muskets while standing up. To add to the effectiveness of their defense, Lee's troops placed fat logs on top of the earthen embankment, supporting the logs so that there was a gap just beneath. This allowed the rebels to fire their muskets through a narrow split of an opening, while the men themselves were almost completely impervious to enemy fire. Now, though Grant had ordered his corps commander to make a careful reconnaissance of what lay in front of him, no one seems to have taken the order seriously. All preparation was for an attack that would begin at 4:30 in the morning, well before anyone could actually see what kinds of defenses waited for them. At precisely 4:30, 3 Federal Corps, nearly 50,000 men, rose up out of their works and poured in several unconnected waves towards Lee's waiting soldiers. The result, according to Confederate General Evander Law, was not war, but murder. In less than 20 minutes, more than 5,000 Union troops were cut down in front of the nearly invulnerable rebel line. And in many places, the ground between the two armies was open woodlands, flat land with no escape for anyone who approached the carefully aimed rebel muskets and artillery. In other places, the ground fell into swampy gullies, low-lying washes of mud and marsh, and that trapped men by the hundreds, massacred by the enemy they couldn't see. As the federal officers drove their men forward, entire companies were wiped out in a single instant, officers and men falling like some grisly game of dominoes. The federal troops who survived the first volleys had virtually nowhere to go, no escape route, no hope of actually breaking through the rebel position. And with so many officers simply wiped away, any cohesion, any coordinated attack simply dissolved. Survivors dropped to the ground, digging frantically with bayonets or tin cups, digging themselves into shallow one-man rifle pits, allowing anything to allow them for even a few inches of protection from the musket fire that blanketed the entire field. So that's how grim the Battle of Cold Harbor was for these men. And that was Jeff Shaara's Civil War battlefields. Discovering America's Hallowed Ground. Cold Harbor is one of the listed battlefields visited or should visit. Now it says here on the federal right flank, the only supporting attack came from Burnside's 9th Corps, which accomplished nothing at all. On Burnside's left, Warren's 5th Corps did virtually nothing. And by 8 a.m., it didn't matter. Though Meade ordered the attacks to resume, all 3 Corps commanders on the left flank responded that no further attack was feasible. It was a grotesque understatement. Horatio Wright, in particular, simply refused to give his men the order. By midday, Grant conceded that the attack had failed. But for the men caught in between the lines, the horror did not end. From the safety of their unbreakable defense, the Confederate troops stared in horror at the carnage that spread out in front of them. Even those who had witnessed the slaughter at Marie's Heights or the bloody land at Antietam could not fathom what the Federal soldiers had been made to do. In places, the dead lay stacked like firewood or spread out in neat formations, entire rows of men just falling as they marched. The wounded lay thick around the men who still crouched in their shallow pits. So many good troops simply unable to move. And despite the horror in the eyes of the Confederates, the men with the muskets still held their aim, still scanned the ground for movement, for any man who showed himself. And for the rest of the day, hundreds of Federal troops lay within yards of the rebel line, desperately counting the minutes until nightfall. So as I walk along now, I believe what is my ancestors and the 89th New York's charge to the Confederate works. Now that I found it, almost fell. First time on a trail. But as I fall into line with them and to what I believe is the route they took to get to the Confederate works, I'm trying to imagine coming under fire just like that I read, and coming into fire just like what I've read, with 4 or 5 other regiments in front of me. I'm still at the back of the road, and as I see here, you might not be able to tell, lines actually in between me. So yeah, I'm actually going to see if I can turn the camera around. This would probably be a better view anyway. Instead of having the camera on me, I might as well put the focus here on these trench lines, because this was Union earthworks. And instead of putting the camera on me, I can actually pan here and show you these earthworks. And as my ancestor, my great-grandfather, or great-greats, walked the same path to get to the Confederate lines at Cold Harbor, that. Yep, there's the white marker. Yeah, I'm on the right path. And we're about to get into maybe some openness here. Yeah. As it may look. Say attached right along this line. Now back to me real quick. From what I've learned, Cold Harbor in numbers wasn't as bloody as, and by the way, you see some of these trenches behind me. Cold Harbor wasn't as bloody and messy as the rest of the Civil War was with other battles. Yeah, you can equate it to Pickett's attack on the third day at Gettysburg, or you can compare it to the charge out in Franklin at the Battle of Franklin to the Carter House. But the reason why many believe this attack failed was because it was done in piecemeal. The greatest attack led by an army would have taken place at Gaines Mill, or did take place at Gaines Mill 2 years before, when Lee threw 50,000 plus of his men, which was like pretty much the entire army of the Northern Virginia, which though it was named at the Union lines at Gaines Mill, and they overwhelmingly succeeded in beating the Union, even though that more or less they were in retreat at Gaines Mill. From what I remember, McClellan didn't do so well there, young Napoleon. But with Cold Harbor, it was more in your face, and it also would kind of remind me about the bloodiness at Spotsylvania Courthouse at the Mule Shoe, or the Bloody Angle, because of the carnage witnessed there, and how much the I wouldn't even say savagery, I would say just the brutality of it took place. So yeah, there's that. That's wild to imagine, but it happened. So now I have here with me Ernest B. Furgurson's Not War But Murder. It was recommended to me by those at the Cold Harbor National Battlefield Park Rangers and the Richmond NPS people. I messaged them a while ago. They gave me a list of books. This is one of them. So I've been doing my best to prepare for this battle, at least to visit this battlefield. So it starts off on page 144. A volley of musketry by the pickets woke J.W.F. Hatton of the Confederate 1st Maryland Battery as he lay in the mud beside his cannon. He threw off his blanket and shouted, "To your guns, boys! Bring up the canister! They're charging!" Infantrymen near the gun position were popping off rounds, then reloading before the Yankees came into range, making sure their powder was dry. All was confusion. Rebel pickets and skirmishers were racing back to the lines behind them, left and right. Hatton saw a blue mass of humanity shouting, firing, with officers directing them with drawn swords with the stars and stripes waving over their ranks. For a moment, the Maryland cannoneers were only nervous spectators, unable to fire because of the retreating Confederates before them. Hatton stepped on top of the breastworks and waved his cap back and forth in his right hand for incoming pickets to see. They understood him and divided as they ran back, leaving a lane before the battery. Hatton jumped down, aimed his gun out the line. And cried, "Fire!" And later exclaimed that his was the first Confederate cannon to open on the charging Yankees that morning. As soon as the pickets were in, the whole rebel line blazed away. The Federal ranks were being thinned, but on they rushed, whooping and firing. Aiming his cannon low, Hatton made his shots ricochet into the oncoming Yankees rather than sail over their heads. I guess they learned from Gettysburg. The attackers swerved away toward works held only by riflemen. Swinging the trail of his piece, Hatton followed them with fire, throwing a wall of canister across the front with friendly infantry. He recalled the bursting of shells and popping of muskets, the deafening roar of artillery and rattling of arms, the whizzing of bullets, the shrieks of the wounded and the moaning of the dying. And yet, despite this pandemonium that cannot be described, nor forgotten. Some Confederates just behind the defensive ridge did not realize yet that the great battle had begun. They had driven in Patton's pickets and broken through the center of his line. We're talking about Barlow's Yankees here. Capturing 4 guns of Captain William H. Caskey's Virginia battery in furious point-blank fighting. Some rebels nearby maintained that Breckinridge's whole line fled panic-stricken and that Patton's brigade broke and ran away. But John K. Thompson, commander of the 22nd Virginia, insisted later that no part of our division ran away, and one New Yorker in the 7th Heavy later declared that the charge of misbehavior imputed to occupants of that salient is unjust and untrue. If any body of troops ever got a warm reception, we did. The enemy bravely stood their ground, not waiting for us to come over their works, but meeting us on the parapet. They contested every inch. Clubbed muskets, bayonets, and sword got in their deadly work. Thompson said that from the rebel command post, he and Patton could not see the Yankees in the mist until they were angling past within 100 yards. According to him, Patton let the attackers rush by and sent his adjutant to rouse the Floridians and Marylanders in reserve. But veterans of the 26th Virginia asserted that their regiment briefly stood firm on one shoulder of the salient. All knew that our line could not hold out against such hosts of the enemy as was converging on us. But the chance to kill Yankees was fine, recalled C.W. Humphreys. He said that the regiment's color bearer, Chap Woodrum, emptied his revolver into the oncoming Federals, then furled his flag and used its staff as a spear. About to stab another attacker, he was shot dead. And the memoirist's brother, C.B. Humphreys, grabbed the flag, only to have it jerked away by 4 Yankees. He watched them pass it back, hand to hand, until he was disarmed and ordered to the Federal rear. So that's the story of the Confederates who were assaulted upon during Cold Harbor, 4:30 a.m. Wild to think. Now for the famous General Law and what he had to say about the Battle of Cold Harbor in Not War But Murder by Ernest P. Furgurson, Cold Harbor of 1864. It says here on page 149, Law watched the Yankees charge over the old line manned only by skirmishers. The attackers, thinking this was a breakthrough, let out a cheer and rushed into the boggy ground below. The line followed line until the space closed by the old salient became a mass of writhing humanity upon which our artillery and musketry played with cruel effect. Law wrote, the impressible Lieutenant Falligan of Callaway's Georgia Battery worked his Napoleon furiously at the heel of the horseshoe. Law, looking from the slope behind, was afraid his riflemen were firing so fast that they would run out of cartridge. He ran forward to the trenches where his men were confidently laughing and joking as they blazed away. There he could see more plainly the terrible havoc made in the ranks of the assaulting column. In front of the 15th Alabama, the Yankees had come within about 30 strides when Oates ordered his single artillery piece to cut loose with double charges of canister. Now, canister is almost made up like a shotgun shell. Lots of iron balls inside a tin can pretty much, and once it's shot, the tin kind of rips open and the balls disperse just like a shotgun, and then you're putting double in it. That's going to have a way more effect than just single. It'll just have more balls going down range and creating more carnage. It's probably because mainly there's a huge line of assault coming from the Union. So in front of the 15th Alabama, the Yankees had come within about 30 strides when Oates ordered a single artillery piece to cut loose with double cartridges of canister. So close were the oncoming troops that the flame from the muzzle of the cannon shot right into their ranks. After a minute or two of this, the Federals pulled back, only to try again 40 minutes later. This effort, aimed at the 4th Alabama, broke out against what Oates called the most destructive fire I ever saw. The Alabamians threw up a wall of seemingly automatic fire. As they emptied their single shooters, they passed them back to Bryan's Georgians, who reloaded and handed them forward. Oates said, "I could see the dust fog out of a man's clothing in 2 or 3 places at once, or as many balls would strike him at the same moment. In 2 minutes, not a man of them was standing. All who were not shot down had laid down for protection." In Hoke's front, before Colquitt's brigade, a correspondent reported that he had never seen as many dead in one place. Russell's Yankees came up to the butchery splendidly, and our men like shooting them so well that they, as long as they can, get ammunition and something to eat. They will stand in the breastworks and let Grant bring up the whole Yankee nation. A bullet nicked General Law above the eye, making him one of the few ranking Confederate casualties on a day that was devastating to brigadiers and colonels in the Union Army. Law had vivid memories of dead Yankees, stacked up before the railroad cut at 2nd Manassas and at the stone wall of Fredericksburg, but he had never imagined anything like this morning at Cold Harbor. It was not war, he wrote. It was murder. Emory Upton, whose brigade had taken heavy casualties cracking the 1st Confederate line in a previous effort, covered this day in a single sentence of his otherwise detailed campaign report. June 3rd, another assault was ordered, but being deemed impractical along our front was not made. In letters home, he would say much more. Major Henry R. Dalton, adjutant of Russell's division, wrote that another advance was ordered and attempted along the whole line, but little ground was gained, however, and other works were immediately thrown up under sharp and deadly musket fire. Not one of Wright's divisions got as far as the main Confederate trenches. They met frontal fire, enfilading fire from the right and from the left, musketry and artillery. And it was more than this already shaken core, or any flesh and blood could endure. Where the line stopped, it stayed, and dug in or died. Frank Wheaton was the only one of Wright's brigadiers who included in his report even the pro forma line that the troops of his brigade advanced with spirit. They carried that Wheaton called the first and imperfect line of rifle pits, the original works beside the ravine now abandoned by the Confederates. But in trying to take the second line, Law's repositioned main line, they were repulsed with great loss. Brigadier General Lewis A. Grant, heading the Vermont Brigade in Neal's division, moved his troops up to relieve Wheaton's battered command. After he was stopped cold, 2 of his regiments were left needlessly exposed. He asked permission to withdraw them, leaving a skirmish line, but permission was refused. Grant, thinking of his men's lives, moved them away. Eventually, Confederate commanders in that sector ordered their infantry to stop firing. Men in the trenches beckoned to Federal officers on the field to drive them in, to bring their troops into the lines as prisoners rather than risk further slaughter. When they did not respond, a deadly fire was poured into their ranks, and few escaped. Thousands of Union soldiers, dead and wounded, lay within rifle range of the Confederate works. Many others, unhurt, tried to make themselves invisible, unwilling to risk running back under vicious rebel sharpshooting. It was almost impossible to move and live. The lifting of a head or hand being a signal for volleys of musketry. Soldiers lying surrounded by fallen comrades pulled the dead bodies close to hide behind them. Some of the survivors dared to stumble into the defensive lines and surrender. A few who tried this were shot by Union troops behind them before they reached safety as prisoners. Law, after watching what happened at the center of the attack, said it gave a fair picture of the results along the entire line. A grand advance, a desperate struggle, a bloody and crushing repulse. But that was easier to see from the Confederate works than from the Union headquarters. At the end of the day, the butcher's bill, as would be called, would be roughly 12 to 13,000 casualties on the Union side. There'd be roughly 9,000 wounded, 2,000 missing, and almost 2,000 dead. It isn't necessarily the biggest casualty loss for the Union, considering what we've seen at other battles, but it was quite significant. And I remember reading in Not War But Murder that the Union soldiers before the attack were actually stitching their names or writing their names on their uniforms because they even felt or they even knew that they won't make it back. And they wanted to make sure that their bodies would be buried properly. There was a note in here saying, you saw the men stitching on the back of their coats, their names and their ranks and whatnot. And it was the night before, on June 2nd, they were doing this. Which comes to show that soldiers' intuition is pretty accurate. 12,000 of 3 corps total casualties. Yeah, they're gonna want to make sure that they're identified. But it was not as bad. The 89th New York did not suffer as many casualties because they attacked in the last bit of the line. But again, it was more of a covering fire, more or less. But they still assaulted the Confederate earthworks at Cold Harbor at this point. It's a little far up the road, but they're demolished by now, and it's on private property, those earthworks and everything else. So I can't go much further. So I've been more or less mulling about and hanging out here towards the end of the national park boundary line. But to be here to see the terrain, because not much of it's changed since the battle. That's overwhelming to think. Any kind of loss is bad. And reading about it and putting it to actual, sight and visibility, that's another thing. And I cannot just imagine it's the horror that the soldiers had to face, because even at some points they couldn't see the Confederates shooting at them. They were just getting shot, and they were just getting cut down, and they were just suffering they were just suffering. And this battle was just a mix of all the other battles, from what it seems, put together. Spotsylvania Courthouse, Fredericksburg, the Bloody Angle, Mary's Heights at Fredericksburg, as I said, Pickett's Charge even, and it was done in piecemeal. That's what some historians believe, since it was done in piecemeal, this attack, and it wasn't done all at once, which what Grant wanted. He wanted to attack a whole force, but it was broken up in piecemeal. That's what made them lose. That's what these historians believe. I can understand that because it gains mill again. But it was a bloody mess. And Grant will learn from it. So, now, with Cold Harbor, it would almost spell the end of Grant's overland campaign was started over a month ago, or at least almost a month ago. You know, it would end about June 15th, June 16th of 1864. And there have been so many histories written about Cold Harbor, but is often overlooked for the most part. Cold Harbor is where Grant earned his butcher's bill kind of name, like Grant the Butcher, stuff like that, by most lost cause people and historians, or people who wanted just to give him a bad name. This is the battle he even writes about in his memoirs, and it haunts him for a long time. And with Cold Harbor, this is where you sort of kind of see what warfare looks like during the First World War. Americans have already somewhat experienced it. You know, it's also more like Petersburg or even Vicksburg in some sense, but like this is where like the roots can be traced to Cold Harbor and the American learning of warfare to happen in the future. So with that, I hope you like this video, and if you can, like, comment, subscribe, hit the little notification bell, and wait for more updates, and see you guys all in the next video. Have yourselves a good one.